Hey, thanks for stopping by the Watercolor Methods YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe so you'll find out when we've got something new posted for you to watch. And maybe check out our website, watercolormethods.com, where we've got over 200 full-length, in-depth watercolor lessons and tutorials that you might like. In the meantime, let's take a look at this lesson.
In this lesson, we're going to learn a very important, but to my mind, a very often overlooked watercolor technique. It's called the dry and wet technique, and that may tell you kind of what we're going to be doing when we practice it. But I consider it to be really one of the fundamental techniques that you need to learn to get a handle on this medium. It's very useful in all kinds of painting for getting things like distinct but soft edges, for instance in this passage of distant trees here in this painting. It can also be used actually in other areas of your painting, like the foreground. This set of purpley weeds right here is actually done with the dry and wet technique, as are actually the trunks of the three trees that you see in this painting. By the way, this very fast, kind of wet and loose sunset painting is one of the lessons here on Watercolor Methods, and there's a link to it down below, so you can click on that and go try this lesson if you'd like to do it. In that lesson, you'll actually use the wet and wet as well as the dry and wet, and a couple other techniques that we'll be practicing as well. So it's a very useful technique. You can see how useful it was actually in this painting. So we're going to practice it in this video lesson today. We're going to do it two different ways. I've got it drawn. I've got a little kind of landscape drawn on two different pieces of paper. Both pieces of paper are actually Arch's 140-pound cold press, which I really recommend for painting in watercolor, especially if you're new to the medium, but even if you're not. If you've painted for a while and haven't used Arch's 140-pound cold press, you really should try it. It's great for helping you manage those very wet washes, of which we're going to be using some in these exercises, as well as the dry and wet and some of the other techniques that we'll be using. And again, on these pieces of paper, they're very small. They're about 5 by 7, both of them. And I've got these little compositions drawn on them. There's really not much to either one of them. This one is really more or less a distant landscape. It's got a sky and what looks like is going to be a field here in the foreground, and a tree line back there and about a quarter of the way up from the bottom. Now, I don't have a drawing layout, but this is really easy. It's basically this sort of wavy line right here at the bottom where the distant edge of the field is, and then this sort of irregular line that goes up and down back here, which is showing where the tops of our trees are that we'll be painting in that case. And in the next one, it's again kind of a lot of sky, and then a field with some weeds here in the foreground, a little bit of a line marking the edge of the field back there, a scraggly old tree of any kind, whatever you draw there is fine. Do show a lot of the branches. It's going to be an autumn tree. We're going to put some autumn leaves on that. And again, a little bit of line here. That's all you have to draw. No drawing layout for this one for you to download. Just sort of draw whatever you can and get those two sheets of paper ready. Again, about 5 by 7 and really simple compositions. I want to take a look at the palette and the colors that I've got out that we'll be using actually in both of these little compositions, and the brush that I'll be using primarily. The colors I have out are ultramarine blue. There's a big puddle of the ultramarine blue out here. We'll be using that for the sky, but we'll be using it in some other areas of both of those little paintings as well. This is permanent alizarin crimson. I have a puddle of that out. We'll be using it also in the sky, but also in the landscape. And then I've got a little bit of burnt sienna out here. We'll be using some of that actually in the landscape, nice and wet. But the other thing we'll be doing in this little exercise is we'll be using all three of those colors very dry, meaning right out of the wells. So for the ultramarine blue and the permanent alizarin crimson and the burnt sienna, at later stages in both of the paintings, we'll be picking up colors out of the wells themselves, not really mixing them with a lot of water on the palette, but using them dry, which is where the dry and wet comes from. We'll be using them dry in these paintings. But you can go ahead and get puddles of the ultramarine blue, the alizarin crimson, and the burnt sienna out on the palette, get them ready to go, and then we'll start painting. So now we're back and we're really ready to start our dry and wet painting exercise. Now, as the description sort of tells you, we're going to be putting some dry paint into a wet passage. So that means we've got to have a wet passage first. I'm going to do that with, I'm going to use my medium round. And I'm going to just paint a sky in up here at the top. Wet and wet, I'm going to have it grayed. If you've done the video on the wet and wet technique, you've already done this. If you haven't done that one, when you finish this lesson, you'll want to go back and look at that one, I think. But it'll show you how to do the gradation. We're going to do it in this lesson as well, but there's another video just on wet and wet technique, which is what we'll be using here. And then we're going to do some foreground area. Now the colors that I'm using really suggest that it's either fall or winter. I don't really want to do a winter scene right now, so we'll do a fall scene, and we'll be putting browns and grays actually in the foreground area here before we put the trees in that middle area. I'm picking up my ultramarine blue, and I'm starting with a fairly dark application of it in the very top of the sky. You can see that there already. I'm going to get a little bit of water and just start pulling it down. And this is how I get both a wet and wet wash as well as a graded wash, a wash with gradations in it, meaning I'm gradually changing from one thing to another. In this case, from blue to lighter blue. And then down here where I've got clear water, I'm going to mingle a little bit of my permanent alizarin crimson to get that warmth that we often see right at the horizon in our skies. Just to get them to mingle a little bit better, since it's nice and wet, I can take my brush and stroke back and forth just a little bit to get some of that nice blending that I want from the way up here at the top of the sky down in near the horizon. I'm going to leave that for the moment. Go back and pick up actually burnt sienna by itself. And again, we're going to pretend this is a autumn scene with weedy fields that have gone dry and now they're all brown. I might actually mingle a little of my alizarin crimson in there, get a little bit of redder, kind of red-orange color in there. A couple spots of ultramarine blue. I'm being very random with this area in the foreground, just getting a suggestion of something happening there without being too specific. And you can see that that was a nice wet and wet mingling there. So if you haven't practiced it in that other video, you've had a great chance to practice it now in this video here. So we've got this great wet layer of paint already on the paper. And what we want to do now is go back and put in our distant tree line dry and wet. So we'll be using the dry and wet technique. Now I'm going to get very dry, it's not really dry, but it's moist, you might say, ultramarine blue paint out of the well. And then I'm going to get burnt sienna out of its well. Again, moist, it's not really dry. I call it dry, it's not really dry. And I'm mixing them together a little bit on the palette without any water. But you can see it's a very thick sort of dark gray color. And I'm going to use that to start putting in my trees. And what I'm doing is just with the tip of the brush I'm working, I'm not quite up to the edge of the pencil line, because you can see what happens is it sort of blooms and bleeds out into that wet area. So as I put the dry color on, you can see what's happening. So I work, again, I'm not quite at the pencil line because I know that that color is going to spread a little bit. It's dry, so it doesn't spread a lot, but it's going to spread a little bit. A little bit over here. There's some trees back in this area and over here as well. So there you go. Really quickly and easily with that dry and wet technique, really a combination of two techniques, the wet and wet and then the dry and wet, I was able to get in a nice, beautiful graded sky, blue to a lighter blue to pink really at the horizon, and to get in a nice wet and wet suggestion really of a field here in the foreground. And then into those wet passages, I just mingled that very dark gray color that I'm using for my distant tree line. Very thick paint, not really dry. I say dry and wet, but it's not really dry, but it's very thick paint right out of the wells without much water in it, and I let it do its thing. I drop it in there and let the paint then sort of mix and mingle around, spread out a little bit, and it very quickly and easily creates that nice looking distant tree line. I do have a bead of water sitting right here along the bottom edge of the painting where the tape is, and I want to get that up because otherwise it's going to bloom back into that passage, and I don't want it to do that. So there's, again, our quickly and easily our dry and wet technique, or at least one way we can use the dry and wet technique. So if you were able to keep up and finish this, great. We're going to go on to the next one. If not, then certainly just pause the video, try to get caught up to this point, get your first little landscape painting with the dry and wet technique, get that done to this point, and then set it aside and we'll go on to the next one. And now here's our next exercise. Again, it's another little landscape painting. It's going to have a lot of sky, which we're going to do wet and wet, similar to the way we did the first little exercise. And we're going to put in a little bit of a field in the foreground as well. And this time, dry and wet, we're going to put in the weeds here in the foreground. And we're going to do a little bit on the trunk of that tree, and then we're going to put a little bit, show a little bit of like autumn leaves on that tree as well. So that's how we're going to handle this exercise. I'm going to be using two brushes. I'll be using my medium round like I did in the first one. But for that tree in the distance, to get some of those marks on the trunk, I'll be using this brush, which is really it's a rigger, but it's got kind of square edges on it, which actually help do things like those trees. But I'll go back to the palette and again pick up my ultramarine blue and start putting strokes of that in my sky. I think I'd like it a little bit darker up there, so I'm going to get more of the ultramarine blue. There we go. I'll go back to the palette with a little more water and pick up a little bit more of that blue and pull that a little further down into the lower parts of the sky. Now I'm just going to put in a stroke or two of clear water and then pick up my permanent alizarin crimson and let that mix and mingle into the background back there as, again, that warmth that we often see at the horizon in our paintings. In our paintings for sure, but even in reality we often see that nice warm kind of glow at the horizon line in the landscape. In the foreground I'm going to again start with burnt sienna. Pretty thick you can see, but it's nice and fluid. Just marking kind of where my ground plane is, where my foreground field is, and again it's autumn, so it's brown. The weeds have all died and they've turned brown. I'm mingling again some permanent alizarin crimson in there. And I'll probably put a little bit of ultramarine blue right about there. Let those colors mix and mingle together. Again, we're not trying to be real specific about this field and what's in it. We just want to suggest that it's actually there. Now, because I touched those foreground colors of the field into what was already wet sky, you can see it's blooming up, kind of floating up into the sky there a little bit. That's okay. We're going to let that go because it just looks like maybe there's some weeds already there without us having done our dry and wet technique. But to do that dry and wet, I'm going to go now and get very thick burnt sienna out of the well. I'm going to get it on the palette, but I'm not at this point going to mix it with much ultramarine blue, maybe a little bit, but not much. And then I'm going to do my weeds. Now, unlike that tree that I did, or the tree line we did in the first exercise, I am sort of making little strokes, little marks with the tip of the brush to indicate the weeds and the top of the weeds. It looks like, I don't know what kind of plant that would be, but a little bit of a bloom on the top of it there. If you like that, you can do more of those. Maybe I'll pick up a little bit more of the darker color this time and get some darker weeds here mingled in as well. A little bit over here to the right. So there we really have our foreground done. And we've done it with two techniques, the wet and wet first, and then the dry and wet that we used for the weeds both on the left side and a little bit here on the right. Now I'm getting my rigger out at this point, And I'm going to make sure it's really dry, and the way I'm going to do that is clean it out with clear water and then blot it really well with my rag. And then I'm going back to the palette and I'm getting this very thick dark gray that we used actually for the tree line in the first exercise. And I'm getting that on my rigger. And I'm going to carefully start stroking in what looks like the trunk of this tree. Now, looks like I don't have quite enough paint on. Go back and get some more. Now you can see it's sort of also mixing and mingling. Those edges are softening up as I'm stroking in both the trunk and now these major branches. That's okay. For this exercise it works fine. I'm going to get really thick right out of the well ultramarine blue and burnt sienna again and mix up more of that. Get some of that really dark, thick paint. Mix some more of these branches. I don't need too much detail here, just a little bit. And then with that same brush, I want to do this kind of lightly. I'm going to get some permanent alizarin crimson out of the well. Again, very thick. And burnt sienna out of the well. I've already got some on the palette, but if I mix them a little bit more together here, get it nice and thick. I've got sort of reddish looking leaves. Maybe a little more burnt sienna, make them a little more orange. And then I'm going to touch lightly in places where there might be some leaves still hanging onto this. Let's say this is a late fall tree. Now you can see it's sort of spreading out, making these feathery little edges, and that's all right. Again, this is our autumn tree. It's in the distance. We don't see it all that clearly. I'm going to put some of the gray in there now. The bright red on it makes me actually think of spring rather than autumn. So I'm going to gray it down with some of the gray color that I actually used on the trunk of the tree. So there's our autumn tree. It looks a little bit better. I'm going to bring some of that along the ground plane, kind of connect the bottom edge of the tree into the ground plane a little bit. Maybe a couple more strokes of weeds over here. This is so much fun. You get addicted to it and you want to keep doing it, but don't do that. Just do a little bit. There we go. So there's a quick little exercise. And again, we used actually two techniques. We used our wet and wet technique to get the sky and the foreground field in place. And then we used our dry and wet technique again to get the weeds here on the left and the right, our tree, our fall autumn tree back here in the background, and a little bit more of that weedy stuff that we did in the foreground. Now again, if you were able to keep up, hopefully you've got a nice looking little exercise that looks like this. If not, you can either start again if you didn't come out with a result that you really like, or you can just pause here and try to get your little painting up to this level of finish. Bring it up here so we can take a look and you'll have a good reference for what that dry and wet technique looks like. And again, I can't really emphasize enough how important this technique really is in your watercolor painting and how often I feel like it's overlooked and kind of ignored by both instructors and actually watercolor painters themselves. So do practice this, get really good at it. Once it becomes second nature, you'll be adding it to your paintings without even thinking about it, and you'll come out with these tremendously great looking paintings that you'll be so proud of, and partially it'll be due to that technique that you've added in and learned to use in your painting.